Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. It's the first in our Cows and Chaos series for 2020. My name is Caitlin Reeser and I'm hosting today's webinar. Our webinar today is on maintaining stored forage quality over time and the economics. So we're going to look at how you store bales will have an effect on their quality in the fall and also explore the economics of feed storage. Before we begin though, a couple of housekeeping items. If you want to ask any questions, you'll find a question box in your GoToWebinar panel. Type them in there, address them to me, the organizer, and I will ask those questions. Also, the webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link. And as with our other Cows and Chaos series, the webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel. So today we have a couple of presenters, Barry Yaremcio, Beef and Forage Specialist at the Ag Info Center, and Ted Nibourg, Business Management Specialist, also at the Ag Info Center. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Barry.
Thank you, Caitlin. The topic over the last couple of years has either been, I don't have any hay, or my hay is so expensive that I can't afford to buy more for what I need. Or on the other side, we've got a lot of hay in certain areas of the province. What's it worth this year compared to last year? So we're taking a look today more at a few things. How does with the weather that we've had in this last year, maturity has been a question about, the question has been about quality. How does that influence the quality of a forage? And that ties into what is the quality that you're starting with for the forage that you're taking over winter. Looking at forage and yield losses, how different systems, storage systems can influence the quality, and looking specifically at weathering damage on forage that's stored outdoors or unprotected. So how does plant quality change over time? It's a crop of triticale. We had a trial about 5 years ago where we've monitored the quality of the forage from 5-leaf stage, or about 35 days after seeding, all the way through till harvest. And what we found was yield is almost a linear increase. Day 35 was about the 5-leaf stage. We had the study done at Stettler, Evansburg, and Filaire. And you can see that no matter where you are, the yield increase is about the same throughout each of the different sites. Unfortunately, as yield goes up, you can see that protein content goes down. So if you're looking at using the triticale green feed as a feed for lactating cows, you probably need to keep the protein levels at roughly 11% on a dry matter basis, and therefore you would be cutting that crop at about 65 to 70 days after seeding to get the quality that you need. If you're going to be using this for just a pregnant cow in mid and late pregnancy, you can probably let it grow to about 75 days. Fiber contents, they increase up to the full heading point at about 65 days after seeding. And then when the head starts to fill, you can see the acid detergent fibers level going down. And that will help offset energy differentials. As the crop matures, fiber levels go up, energy levels come down for the ADF proportion. But as that kernel fills with starch, it offsets the maturity of the straw. So it's a balancing act between yield and quality, Mother Nature, weather patterns, and time available to harvest the crop. So when you're looking at harvesting the forages, nothing is 100% efficient. There's always going to be losses. There's always going to be interference in harvesting the crop as best as you can. So Savoy out of Eastern Canada in 1982 went ahead and cut a straight alfalfa crop, and he found that he was losing between 10 and 50 kgs per hectare of material during the mowing or cutting stages, 20 to 30 kilograms during late conditioning. In Eastern Canada, they put the hay windrows through a conditioner later, rather than having it as a single machine back then. And then during raking, you're losing between 50 and 80 kilograms. So overall, mowing or cutting, conditioning, raking, and that's only one raking, you're losing between 5 and 7% of the total dry matter yield in the crop. Now, Collins, a little later on, looked at it on a different stage and saying, okay, what are we losing during the dry down until that material gets down to 40% moisture? They're losing 8% of the total yield due to respiration, the using of the soluble carbohydrates and soluble sugars when the moistures are still fairly high. With the wind damage or other mechanical damages, shattering losses, that was up to 8%. Now, out in Western Canada, we're always looking at a way to speed up the rate of drying that you get from after you cut the crop because of weather concerns. Every time you go over a field with a rake, you're going to lose 5% of your dry matter yield. And baling losses, it all depends on how full the baler is and how long it takes for you to make a bale. If you've got a 12-foot windrow or 3.7-meter windrow, you're going to have roughly a 14% baling loss because it takes a long time to fill the chamber, and that rotation of the bale is always breaking off leaves. It's always breaking off stems. Putting 2 windrows together, you can drop that a little bit, but the real advantage is if you can bring 3 windrows together, have a very nice big swath, the bales get made fairly quickly, you're down to 5% loss. And the big thing there is look behind the baler after you've tied it or you've wrapped it. How much of the fine leaf material is behind that baler? That all influences quality and yield. Rainfall, we never can get away with a summer where we can have perfect weather and all the hay comes up dry. So Collins did some work and he cut the hay anticipating rainfalls. They got 1 inch of rain on the alfalfa windrows. This is before they really dried down very far. And what he found was he had a total of 11.7% dry matter loss. Leaf shatter and respiration made up 70% of the total losses. And the big thing he found was the loss of soluble carbohydrate and proteins was the highest components within that feed that were being lost. And looking at it from the other side, 62% of the protein contained in an alfalfa crop at the 10% bloom stage is contained within the leaf material. Now, as a result of this dry matter loss, there were higher fiber levels, which reduces the energy content for ADF. NDF is a limiter on how much feed that the animals can eat, so therefore they were not able to consume as much hay after the rain compared to product that was there before, and also they had a protein loss in that final product as well. The other thing that he looked at was the digestibility. Is the animal able to get as much nutrients out of that hay after it's had a single rain on it? And the digestibility of the baled hay was reduced by 7%. Now, if we take that into consideration for the hay that we have this year, that was cut a little bit late, rained on 2, 3, 4 times, your digestibility is going to be that much lower. Respiration losses during curing, you can lose any place from 2 to 16% of the dry matter from the time it's cut until the material's at below 40% moisture. That all depends on the length of time it needs to dry down the crop, which is also impacted upon by the relative humidity, the temperature, and the other one that comes into this, or the couple other things that should come into this slide as well, is how much wind do you have and how big of a windrow are you trying to dry down. No mechanical method or biological process is 100% efficient. So Johnson in 1984 went out and hand clipped and cut a number of different fields and tried to see what they would get for a total yield. When he compared the yield that he had from the hand clipping with virtually no losses at all against the silages and different types of feed, he found that if the crop was put up into silage, he had 10% less dry matter compared to what he would have got per acre with the fresh hand cuts. Hay stacks, these are the old Heston stacks, 10.6%. Small square bales, 16%. The large round bales, now you're going to remember in 1984, a lot of those round bales were chain and slat balers instead of the belt balers, therefore 30% losses. And the small round bales, this is the old Alice Chalmers type piece of equipment that you see in the picture, 33.6% loss. So we've talked about the harvesting and what happens when that crop gets rained on, but what happens to it when it's carried over winter? Before I go on, any questions from the participants, Caitlin?
No questions at this point, Barry. A reminder, if you do have questions, just to type them into the question box and address them to me, the organizer, and I will ask those. So back to you, Barry.
All right. No different than no biological process is 100% efficient. The other side is always true, that whenever you have environment or weather impacting upon a hay or a silage or any other physical product, there is going to be damages and losses to it. The first picture on the left-hand side of the screen indicates the color discoloration because of just weathering and sunshine on the bales, probably some rain on it to wash out the beta carotene or destruction of the beta carotene because of the snow, or excuse me, because of the sun. And then bales that have been stored for a little while, you can tell just by visual appearance that they're not doing as well as they were when the day they were made. So during storage, bales tend to squat. They will lose their shape. They will drop down. Moisture penetration will come into the bale either over the top surface of the bale or moisture migration up from the ground. And the concern with that is when you get the higher moisture contents, you're going to have mold development in those areas, and cows will refuse to eat that feed. So how much are you actually losing if you do see a bunch of spoilage or discoloration and loss of quality on the outside perimeter of the bale? So let's assume that we're using a 5-foot bale, which is the green line, and you've got 4% or 4 inches of spoilage. You dig into the bale and you can see that there's some form of spoilage down to about 4 inches. That will impact roughly 22, 23% of the total weight in that bale. The feed isn't actually lost, but the bigger side, it will physically be there. There will be probably some material that will be leached out of that plant material, but the digestibility and quality losses will be there. So bales that are stored without a preservative and that are above 18% moisture, depending on the form of the bale, tightness of the bale, there's always the risk of those bales heating. And when temperatures reach 36 degrees Celsius or higher, you get a chemical reaction occurring in the bale. It's called the Maillard reaction, and the soluble sugars are polymerized and stuck to the protein. And when that complex is made, the protein is then stuck to the fiber, and it is not available to the animal. So when that happens, you've got lower availability of both the protein and the energy. And a second test, that ADIN or ADIP, the acid detergent insoluble nitrogen, or acid detergent insoluble protein test, needs to be asked from the lab. Where I've seen a lot of problems with hay that's been slightly above normal moistures or recommended moisture levels is people want to get them off the field. They want to stack them within a couple days of baling. The recommendation there is if you know your bales are a little bit tough, let them sit out for 2 weeks, let the wind get around them, let them dry out as much as possible before you stack them. Now, bale silage, something that really took off this year because of the weather, there's a couple different things that occur. The recommended for a proper bale silage or a true bale silage is to have between 45 and 55% moisture. The bales ferment properly into a true silage, and if the plastic integrity is good, they can be stored for 2-3 years without losing any quality. Bales that were between 30 and 45%, they do go through a fermentation, but it's not full. It's what I call a suspended fermentation. They get about halfway to where it needs to be, and then it quits. And those bales should be used up before it starts warming up next spring, because those bales, once they heat up and thaw, fermentation will start again. It's probably a secondary fermentation, and spoilage can occur. So try to use up the lower moisture silage bales faster than the higher moisture bales. Get them done before spring hits. Moisture content that's 25% or less, what you've done there is put the bales into an environment where after they go through their initial sweat period, they will use up all the oxygen, but there will be no fermentation. Those bales will stay fairly stable, but again, when the weather starts to warm up and things get going for microbial activity, there's a good chance that those will spoil as well. So bale silage, no different than pit silage. You can probably expect any place from 5 to 8% shrink, or the total dry matter in those bales compared to the day that you baled them will probably be 5 to 8% lower. Bale type and density. The soft core bale is a bale that is not as tight or doesn't have the bale density that a hardcore bale is. And with it being softer, either with being tied with twine or with net wrap, those softer bales will allow more infiltration of moisture into the bales. So to shed more water, use a hardcore bale, use a net wrap, and you can see on the last picture on the right-hand side, those bales have actually shrunk, and what used to be a tight bale is one now that the twines are loose and they've lost their structural integrity. So over the second summer, when the rain gets to them, they are going to rot even further. Twine versus net wrap. Net wrap is a product that leaves a more uniform surface on the bale, and it will shed more water than the twine. Because if you look at the top picture, you can see those indentations or the V's where the twines are. That's where the water is going to accumulate, and that's where the spoilage is going to occur. So if you can get a net, if you're using a net wrap, try to use one that is wide enough to go over the shoulder of the bale, and that will help reduce the water infiltration. The other side of the coin is John Deere has developed a product they call the B wrap, and it allows more moisture to migrate from inside of the bale to the outside. So if you're in a situation where you're pushing the envelope a little bit, you've used an inoculant and you still want to dry those bales out a little bit more, then try to see if you can find that B wrap. Storing the bales outside, it's something that a lot of people look at and consider, but if that's the necessary way to go, different stacking methods will definitely influence the quality of the forage. If you can tarp those bales outside, it's better than being uncovered, but you always have to have a way for the orientation of the stack that's going to be covered to allow the wind to get under the tarp. You don't want to cover the ends, you want to cover the top, and the tarps have to be tight enough so they don't rip, but have enough space so that the wind can get in underneath the tarp and carry out any moisture that may condense under the underside of the tarp. The pyramid stack, the one on the top picture, is the one that creates the most damage. Wherever on a year like this where we have had some rains and we've had some warmer conditions and the snow has melted off of the stack, the moisture will migrate down in between the bales wherever they're touching. And as it works its way down from the very top to the bottom of the stack, that's where you're going to see the damage and the spoilage occurring. And if you tear apart a stack like that after a year or two, there's layers of black that every place where those bales touch. The other mushroom stack, one that is fairly common, the top bale will have very little spoilage because the water will run off, and unfortunately it ends up in the bottom bale. You'll get moisture migration in from the ground and also moisture from the runoff from the top bale. And when you've got that flat side, there's nothing stopping that water from going down into the hay. The best way that you can stack bales, if you know that they're going to be staying out there for a while, is single rows. Leave some space between the individual bales and also between the individual rows so that the bales are never touching. It's the location where the bales are touching is where you're going to get spoilage. Some of the work that's been done on what's the physical losses of these bales during storage. If they're stored outside, covered with plastic, Colin's got only 3.6% dry matter loss, which in fact is a little bit better than storing a bale twine wrapped under a shed or indoors at 5.7. The net wrap does a better job of shedding the water, thus reducing the dry matter losses. And you can see an 8% differential between the net wrap and the twine. If bales are stored under plastic, it does prevent the water damage or weather damage to them, as long as the skunks, the magpies, the crows, excuse me, do not get in there and create holes in the plastic. Once you lose the integrity of the plastic and moisture runs in, that's where you're going to see the spoilage. If you're using a wrapper, you do need to seal off the ends of the bales. Make sure that the plastic is completely sealed off the end of the bale when you put the first wraps on, so that no oxygen can get in. Throwing a single bale of straw or a single bale of hay over the end of these rows before you start wrapping the higher moisture product is like putting a screen door on a submarine. It doesn't work. You have to seal them off. Big thing is, fix the holes. If there's a cut or a tear, make sure you get out there with the plastic tape and seal off the problems before the problem gets worse. If you are making a chopped or bale silage, you want to cut, pack, and cover them as quickly as possible after filling. If you're filling a large pit and it's going to take you 2 or 3 or 4 days to complete the pit or the pile, cover as much as possible after the first day is done, up to the point where that pit needs to be filled some more, or where the pile needs to be filled some more. Even that partial cover will help improve the fermentation pattern. If you're using a baler or a bale silage, either wrapped or put into a tube, they need to be under cover within 12 hours of the bales being made so that you do not have competition from aerobic bacteria for a long period of time. The other thing that goes along with the loss of quality, either the soluble sugars, acid detergent and soluble protein due to heat damage or just deterioration, the outer 4 or 5 inches always have the highest loss, the highest quality loss. Now, when you looked at the digestibility of the large round bale, what Lechtenberg did was he put these round bales that have the forage damage or the weather damage to it, they put it through a bale tub grinder, and they found an 8% loss in digestibility for the entire bale. It's not just the outside, it's when everything's mixed together. Even if a cow eats some of the outside and some of the inside, there's going to be a drop in digestibility. There's a 7% loss in digestibility when the bales are stored outdoors versus indoors. And along with that, voluntary feed consumption goes down by 8% for hay that's stored outside, unprotected from the weather. Any questions, Caitlin?
Well, one question regarding, and I know you alluded to this, but how long the bales will actually last, like when you need to be using them. And I guess that a lot of that just depends on how they were stored.
Storage is the one factor that comes into play. You know, is it laid out in a feed yard where there's a lot of grass underneath it? Is it a low area where the water will accumulate in the spring when the snow melts? How much snow do you have between the row of bales, and when it melts, it's going to affect the bottom half of or any of the bale that is attached to the ground. But if it's good quality hay, you'd like to have them used up by the end of the second year, because unfortunately, unprotected, a lot of that hay in the third year is not going to be much better quality than straw. So if you're looking at buying 2-year-old and 3-year-old product, have a feed test done to see what the quality is at the time of purchase, and also take a load of bales, run them across a scale, because those bales will probably be 150 to 200 pounds less than what they were on the day that they were made.
That's the only question right now, Barry.
All right, with that, Caitlin, I am done with my side of the presentation. I am going to pass it over to Ted, our forage management specialist or farm economist here at the Ag Info Center. And with that, Ted, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Barry. Very interesting. So Barry has kind of alluded to all the physical parameters of hay storage, forage storage, and losses. I'm going to try to put some dollar and cents to it. What we're looking at is you know, the first thing we have to consider is what the current feed prices are. Now, I know storage becomes a major issue when we're talking about the current feed prices. I know this year, the last couple of years, the carryover of forage has been just depleted because of loss of production last year, loss of quality this year. So typically producers like to, you know, just to be on the safe side, have a couple of years carryover just in case we run into some of those years that are problematic. This is data that I've accumulated from AFSC on their website on mixed hay. The first cut this year, we're looking at 5.5 to 6.5 cents per pound through the majority of the province. In southern Alberta, they were definitely on the short side of the stick, and their hay prices on mixed hay is over 10 cents a pound. When we're looking at some of the economics of feeding cattle, 8 cents tends to be the break even. So I think when we're looking at hay prices in that 10 cents a pound range, you know, storage, the quality, amount being fed is going to be very critical. Our second cut hay, in the majority of the province, we were looking at 6 to 7.5 cents per pound, and up slightly in southern Alberta. Southern Alberta does have a third cut too, but we didn't get any prices there. But you can almost bet that it's going to be considerably higher. Some of that third cut forage tends to go into the dairy market though. Alfalfa, first cut, 5.5 cents a pound in the Peace Country. Now, there isn't a heck of a lot of alfalfa in the Peace, but it did seem to come off in reasonable shape, and the price was somewhat lower than the North and Central, which was 6.5 to 8 cents a pound. Again, we go into southern Alberta, 11 cents a pound. Again, that stuff would probably go into the dairy market, but some of it does move into the into the feed market as well. Second cut, up slightly in the piece, up increased 7 to 9.5 cents a pound. Typically what we see there is, when we go from first to second cut is because we get an increase in quality, and I think that's something that Barry alluded to earlier. And in southern Alberta, 11.5 cents a pound. Green feed, in the majority of the province, we were looking at 5 to 7 cents a pound. One of the things about green feed that when we're talking about storage at all, it will be discounted. It could be, on a quality basis, it could be as good or if not better than some of the hay that's out there. But it is a little more difficult. It doesn't seem to hold its quality as well as hay does. So it will be discounted at least a penny a pound in some cases. In southern Alberta, again, we were looking at 8 cents a pound, and they were faced with some definite shortages. Silage, and this is 60% moisture. We did see a lot of silage go in this year, not of as a normal course of action, but because it was a method of getting some of that forage up that was difficult to put up in a dry state. The question we have to keep in the back of our mind, though, is what is the quality of that silage? I think there was probably a lot of inexperience in that silage making, and silage is an art. Making silage is an art in itself, and so we have to be a little bit careful on that one. It was about $45 to $55 a ton in the majority of the province, and I'd like to put it down to a per pound price too. That's 2 1/4 to 2.75 cents a pound. I know there's some of the silage that's being priced out there. It's almost up to 4.5 cents a pound, and that's on a wet basis. And so when you kind of factor that down to what it is on a dry matter basis, it gets pretty expensive feed. And we're looking at 70 cents a ton in southern Alberta again because of the shortages, and that's 3.5 cents a pound on a wet basis. And that $45 to $55 a ton is a wet ton. From there, we'll go into the storage and loss. Talk about twine. I think Barry alluded to it a little bit. Twine. When I'm working on these numbers, I'm going to assume that the cutting is going to be similar between twine and net wrap, and we're just going to look at the baling cost, and that runs $11 to $16 a bale for twine. Now, net wrapped will be another 70 to 90 cents a bale extra just for the wrap itself. The equipment cost, you're looking at $5 to $6 grand. That'll add 50 to 60 cents a bale, and that's assuming you're doing about 1,000 bales a year. You find a 2% dry matter handling loss. That's putting it into the bale, and I think a big part of that is because with net wrapping, you're only maybe rotating that bale about 4 times as compared to almost up to 20 times with the twine wrap. And so you can imagine that the leaf loss is going to be tremendous on twine compared to net wrap because you're just spinning it around so much. With the net wrap, and I guess this is again going back to some of the stuff that Barry talked, the dry matter storage losses was about 4% less with net wrap as compared to twine. Because of the speed of putting that into a bale, we get a increased production of about 32%. So you're not only saving money in terms of the dry matter losses, but you're saving time on fuel and labor to put that in a bale. So if we were looking at 6 cents a pound hay, $120 a ton, you're going to have savings as high as $8 a ton, which can be substantial if you've got a fairly large herd. Let's compare bales to the hay shed. Let's look at about a 250 cow herd. They're 1,400 pound cows, 180 days on feed, and they're going to require about 900 tons for that 180 days. And if we're expecting a 50% carryover, that's about 450 tons. Okay, so I'm going to go through a cumulative effect of the losses, not an additive, but a cumulative. So we've got, this is on ton hay. If we're losing 6% of the weight, and it's 85% dry matter, and we take that 6% off, we've got 1,600 pounds of dry matter just on weight losses. And as Barry mentioned, we get some reduced intake wastage. We take another 8% off of that 1,600 pounds of dry matter, and we're down to 1,470. Quality reduction, basically from digestibility, et cetera, protein losses, that sort of thing, we're losing another 20%. So that initial 1 ton of hay, with all the losses combined, that's 1,175 pounds is what you've got left at the end of the day. So the total loss is just about 30%, around 30%, which is fairly significant. So if we bought that, if it was valued at 6 cents a pound, $120 a ton, we're looking at 54 grand right then. That 54 grand at 30% loss, there's $16,000 loss in a year, which is very significant. That'll probably buy you about 10 cows. Well, 8 cows maybe. The hay shed will cost you about 100,000. The annualized investment cost at 5% would be about 5 grand. So the net savings, you've saved loss of about 16. That $16,000 loss, it's going to cost you 5 for that hay shed. Your net saving is about 11 grand. And so at that $120 a ton, you're going to have a repayment on that hay shed of over 9 years. Now, one of the things that really, is really important, it really comes home, is the price of hay in terms of the losses. If hay is really cheap, we've had years, I can remember back not too long ago when we had hay prices down in that 3 cents, 4 cents a pound range, and yeah, you didn't worry too much about losses because, there was lots of it around. It was cheap. Cattle market was good. Why worry too much? But when we start getting the prices that we've experienced the last couple of years, last year we were up to some cases 14 cents, which was cost prohibitive. But this was not the year 2018, not 2019. Hay prices were up that high. They normalized a little bit last year, but not to the extent that they had. So if our hay was priced at 4 cents a pound, your repayment is about 17 years. So you may, if hay stays at 3 to 4 cents a pound, begs the question whether a hay shed is going to be worth it for all the hassle. At 5 cents a pound, the repayment is just about 12 years, which isn't too bad. 7 cents a pound, it's over 7 years, a little over 7 years. Now at 8 cents, and I mentioned earlier that 8 cents is kind of break even. If we start paying much more than 8 cents on a long-term basis for hay, and we do see that when hay prices get high, we see a lot of liquidations and sell-offs in cow herds, or at least reductions anyways, because it just doesn't pay. At 8 cents, we're looking at a 6-year repayment. Okay, let's go to silage. Pit silage, again, I'm not going to worry too much about the cutting, or whichever way you're going to do it, you're going to have to cut it. But the chopping, hauling, packing, and covering will run you about $9 to $12 a wet ton, which is 35% dry matter. Okay. Now, bagging, we're going to assume 2,000 pound bales. Typically what people do, they tend to, once you get the water in there, and if they're normal 1,400, 1,500 pound bales, you'll be easily a ton bale anyways too. Hopefully you've got the hydraulics in your tractor to handle them. And that brings up another thing too. When it comes to some of the damage, you have to be very careful with the bag silage, that you're not puncturing those bags when you're moving around. So you might tend to use a grapple rather than a spike or a front end loader. We got 50% dry matter. Typically when the feed is put into bags of silage, it's a little drier than it goes into the pit. So we're looking at about 50% dry matter. Your baling costs are going to run $15 a bale for those big bales. Your hauling is going to run $5 to $6 a bale. Your wrapping is going to run $5 to $10 a bale. So your total cost per wet ton is going to run an extra $16 to $19 per ton for bagging. Now, the single bale wrapper is going to cost you anywhere from 10 to 25 grand, which will add another $1 to $2.50 a bale. The inline tube, baling and hauling is similar to the individual bag silage. You still have to bale it, and you still have to haul it, and you have to bring it to the bagger. The wrapping, because instead of using an individual bag per bale, they're sort of sharing the wrapping, and it'll run you $2.50 to $5 a bale less. But the inline wrapper itself is not cheap. It's anywhere from 20 grand to 45 grand. So that'll add $2 to $4.50 a bale, which is almost a wash for the reduced wrapping cost. The production efficiency, however, with the inline tube is 3 to 4 times greater than a single bale, because you throw the bale in the wrapper and away you go, and it just kind of continuously wraps it. Whereas with the individual bales, you're having to stop and go just to wrap them. Now let's assume the storage and quality losses are non-existent once we've got them wrapped and they're stored properly, and you've got no damage to the outer layers. The majority of the quality loss and waste occurs at feeding, whether you're opening in the pit, whether you're, and especially with the inline tubes, if you're opening the end of that tube, you may want to try to cover that again. But if you just left it exposed, that's where you're going to have the quality loss. And you know what it's like when you're hauling out of the pit, when you're hauling out of the bag, there's going to be stuff that kind of shakes off the end of the front end loader, and you get losses that way too. So any damage to the bags will result in quality loss. And I think Barry alluded to this as well too, that you have to make sure that the magpies don't get in there and the skunks don't get in there, because in a lot of cases, when you do have that damage from the birds or the rodents, your quality loss will actually increase, because you tend to accumulate it all in one spot, and there's no air infiltration, no way of getting that dried out. It just actually will be worse than if it was just a bale that was exposed out in the elements. Any questions?
Not at this point, Ted. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, to type them in the question box. But that's great seeing that. It's always great when we see actual numbers, Ted, when you show the different scenarios. And I guess it just shows the importance of knowing what you've got and knowing the economics of your own operation.
Well, certainly those numbers were just kind of examples to kind of give people a heads up. And I think what you're looking at, the losses, whether it's storage losses or quality losses, is going to vary from year to year. It's going to vary from producer to producer. So I think everybody has to kind of really look at their own situation. And I think over and above what the cost of those losses are, I think you have to really mitigate those losses. I mean, maybe not putting all those bales in a low spot where the water drains to, and a lot of the things that Barry was talking to in terms of stacking them and things like that, getting away from that can save money, and you don't even have to run the numbers. So.
Yeah, definitely lots to think about, both the storing, in Barry's presentation and then yours on the economics. I don't see any more questions at this point. I would like to thank both Barry and Ted for taking the time. Very, very informative presentations today. A reminder that this webinar will be posted on YouTube, and people will also get a link to the actual recording. And our next webinar in the Cows and Chaos series, we're back for 2020, is on February the 13th, and it's on public and stakeholder engagement, getting your story out. Our presenter is Amy Peck, Stakeholder Engagement Manager with the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. So with that, I don't see any further questions. So thanks again to Barry and Ted, and thank you to everybody who participated today. And we hope you join us next week on February the 13th. And have a great day.